Hello, you're watching News.Markets. Activist shareholders are shaking up corporate boardrooms in record numbers as they look to exert influence at a time of swelling company cash piles. Companies the size of Swiss bank UBS, high street giant Sainsbury's and logistics firm John Menzies have been targeted over the past year. In Europe, the number of companies subjected to activist demands has risen 126% since 2010. Around the world, the number has risen some 250%. Are the rules and conventions of the markets really changing as more firms are capitulating to outside investors and more have started to think like them? Josh Black, editor of Activist Insight, joins me now. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
Are activist investors corporate raiders or actually a breath of fresh air for boardrooms?
The corporate raider stereotype is really born out of the 1980s takeover boom, and what activists do these days is take minority positions in companies and use other shareholders as a platform to promote their ideas for the ways they think companies could be improved. And it's very hard to exert that influence without getting a majority of shareholders on side. So they're really not associated with the kind of underhand tactics that corporate raiders used anymore.
Can you think of a case recently where they've got their way, that they've shaken things up, they've agitated for change and it's changed the shape of the business?
Yeah, well, there's a great example is Yum! Brands, which is the franchisee company behind KFC and Pizza Hut. And what happened there is an activist came along in May and made a presentation in New York and said that they should consider spinning off their Chinese arm because that was set for outsized performance and was a racier stock that hedge funds would prefer to own. 6 months later, the company did exactly that and invited the activists on the board to oversee the process. So we're really seeing activists gaining a lot of traction with boards. The financial advisors who review their proposals tend to agree with them in many cases, and their success levels have really risen over the last 5 years to around 2/3, at least partially successful.
So do you think more companies are starting to think like activist shareholders rather than have interlopers come in and take their positions?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, two great examples. General Electric invited Nelson Peltz of Triumph Fund Management to speak to their employees 2 years ago and started a big shape up of the business. They spun off the capital division and focused on the industrial side. And this year, Triumph took a major position in GE, some $2.5 billion, showing that they were willing to invest on the back of the company's turnaround plan rather than forcing it through. And the same investor, Nelson Peltz, was invited onto the board of Madison Square Gardens, despite not being a shareholder in the company.
Well, it sounds like this is just another way of getting consultants in, or is this a shift, having people with a bit of ownership, even if it's only small, having a bigger say?
No, absolutely. I mean, activists do a tremendous amount of work. They've borrowed a lot of people over time from investment banking, private equity. They sometimes spend millions of dollars preparing their white papers and reports on how they think the companies could be performing better. And so a lot of the time it is free advice for companies.
What sectors tend to be more vulnerable to this kind of activity or more open to it? Do you see trends in that regard, that there are certain sectors that invite this kind of activity?
Yeah, I mean, in the UK and Europe, the financial sector, particularly investment trusts, has been a historic focus. We've seen Alliance Trust this year and Electra Private Equity even more recently. That's now less and less of the bulk of activism. We're seeing more activists focus on operating companies with many employees, and there's still a focus on sectors with high M&A ratios, so technology and healthcare, but really it's kind of across the board nowadays.
Well, it sounds like the investment landscape really is changing. Josh Black from Activist Insight, thanks ever so much.
Thank you.